After a busy week at work, I was thrilled to finally meet up with Susan, one of my closest friends, at our favorite pub in town. Life had gotten so hectic since moving to the city with Thomas, my husband, and I missed spending time with old friends who knew me inside and out. Tonight, I wanted nothing more than to relax and laugh like we used to. The pub was cozy, and we found a corner where we could chat without much noise. We ordered a round of drinks, and as we started reminiscing, I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in a while. Susan was already cracking jokes, and I couldn't help but feel grateful for this little escape. But just as I was laughing at one of her stories, I heard a voice from a nearby table that made my laughter catch in my throat. I turned slightly, and my heart began to pound. It sounded just like Thomas. He had told me he'd be working from home tonight. Curiosity filled my mind, but I tried to brush it off. Perhaps he had a last-minute change of plans. Still, something didn't feel right. I found myself leaning closer, trying to listen without being obvious. As I strained to hear more, I heard something that sent a cold shiver down my spine. A woman's voice, soft and laughing, responded to Thomas. My stomach twisted with unease. Who was this woman, and why was my husband with her? 1,000 thoughts rushed through my head. Was this an innocent meeting, or was there something more? Trying to mask my shock, I glanced at Susan, who was still talking, oblivious to my sudden distraction. I didn't want to ruin our evening with wild assumptions, but the uneasiness grew stronger. I leaned in again, this time listening closely to the conversation at the next table. It was unmistakably Thomas's voice, talking softly but excitedly. I couldn't help myself. I pulled out my phone and discreetly opened the recording app. I hit record, telling myself it was just in case, a way to put my mind at ease. Susan noticed my distraction and gave me a concerned look. "Everything okay?" she asked, but I just nodded, not ready to share my suspicion. I didn't want to believe that Thomas could be hiding something from me, but I couldn't ignore the strange feeling gnawing at my gut. Trying to keep my composure, I focused on their voices. Thomas's tone was low but excited as he told the woman about my family's warehouse back home. He described it like it was some hidden treasure chest, full of valuable antiques waiting to be uncovered. "There's a fortune in that place," he said, his words filled with excitement. The woman, who I now recognized as Karen, an old friend I hadn't seen in years, laughed softly. "It's amazing they haven't done anything with it," she replied. My hands grew clammy as I listened to their conversation. Thomas hadn't mentioned Karen in years, and I had no idea they'd reconnected. Why were they even talking about my family's belongings? My thoughts raced as I tried to piece things together. Was Thomas really planning something behind my back? The disbelief was overwhelming, but I couldn't look away. I felt frozen in my seat, forced to listen as the people I trusted spoke about things they had no right discussing. I kept my phone recording, silently praying that this was all a misunderstanding. As they continued, the words became sharper, their intentions clearer. Thomas spoke about selling off the antiques, saying it would be easy money. "They don't even know what they have," he whispered, his tone almost mocking. Karen agreed, adding that my family never appreciated the value of such items. My heart dropped as I realized they were actually plotting to steal from my family. I clutched my phone tightly, feeling a rush of betrayal that was almost too much to bear. Thomas, my husband, the man I trusted with everything, was conspiring with an old friend to profit off my family's possessions. I wanted to storm over to their table, confront them, demand an explanation. But something stopped me. Susan, who had been watching me closely, leaned in and whispered, "Do you want to leave?" I shook my head, struggling to keep my composure. She looked at me, concerned but trusting my decision. She didn't know the whole story yet, but her silent support meant everything to me. I took a deep breath, determined to hear more before making any rash decisions. Then, as if things couldn't get any worse, Thomas mentioned Lisa, another friend I'd made since moving to the city. Lisa had been so helpful, guiding me through my adjustment to city life. The idea that she too was part of this plan felt like a knife to the heart. "Lisa's going to help us move some of the more valuable pieces tonight," Thomas said to Karen, his tone casual, as if they were discussing a simple errand. "She's smart. If we time it right, no one will even know they're missing." At that moment, I felt the world tilt. It wasn't just Thomas. 2 people I had trusted implicitly were plotting to deceive me. It was as if the floor had fallen out from under me. I felt Susan's hand on my arm, grounding me. She must have sensed my distress, but she didn't say anything, just squeezed my arm gently. I took a shaky breath, fighting the urge to confront them. Instead, I whispered to Susan, We need to keep recording. This is bigger than I thought. As their plan continued to unfold, I heard Thomas talk about creating an alibi. He and Karen would pretend they were together in public, providing cover for Lisa as she moved the items. My stomach churned with a mix of anger and fear. I knew that confronting them here would only make things worse. If I wanted justice, I needed to be smart. Susan squeezed my arm again, her silent reassurance helping me focus. I nodded to her, indicating that I was okay, at least for now. I needed more evidence before I could act. I thought back to the quiet, trusting life I had led before this moment, feeling as if everything had changed in an instant. I couldn't believe that the man I had married, the person I had built a life with, was capable of such betrayal. The anger inside me grew with each passing second, but I knew I had to be patient. I had to think things through. Susan and I stayed as discreet as possible, pretending to be deep in conversation, while my phone continued to record the betrayal unfolding right beside us. I excused myself to the restroom, where I took a moment to compose myself. The shock of everything was overwhelming, but I knew what I had to do. My hands were shaking as I called the police, explaining the situation as calmly as I could. I gave them my location and briefly explained what I'd overheard. The officer on the other end sounded skeptical, but promised to send a patrol to my parents' neighborhood. I wasn't sure they fully believed me, but it was a start. Returning to Susan, I found her waiting with a mixture of concern and determination. She looked at me, reading the resolve in my expression. "We're going to get through this," she said quietly, and I nodded, grateful beyond words for her support. Just as I sat back down, I noticed Thomas checking his phone. He looked irritated, his expression darkening as he read a text. I realized it must be Lisa, and that their plan was already falling apart. From the way Thomas was reacting, it seemed that things were not going according to plan. I couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. The police presence must have spooked Lisa, disrupting their scheme. I watched as Thomas muttered something angrily to Karen. His frustration was obvious, and he kept glancing around the pub, as if looking for a way out. It was almost laughable, watching him squirm, but the pain of his betrayal kept me grounded. I reminded myself to stay calm, to keep my focus on gathering as much evidence as possible. Susan gave me a reassuring smile, and I took comfort in knowing I wasn't alone. In that moment, I realized that I had the upper hand. Thomas, Karen, and Lisa were too focused on their plan to notice me, too consumed by their greed to see that they were about to face the consequences. I could feel my confidence growing as I sat there, silently recording every word. Once their conversation finally ended, I took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. I knew what I had to do. Susan and I left the pub quietly, my phone still holding the recording that would serve as undeniable proof of their betrayal. That night, I began making plans. I knew I couldn't stay with Thomas after this. The next day, I contacted a lawyer, explaining the situation and preparing the groundwork for a divorce. Thomas had no idea what was coming, and I intended to keep it that way. I acted as if everything was normal, going about my routines, keeping up appearances. Inside, though, I was steeling myself for the inevitable confrontation. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to reclaim my life, to free myself from the web of lies and deception he had spun around me. A few days later, the pieces finally fell into place. With my lawyer's support, I gathered the necessary documents and began the process of cutting ties with Thomas. When I finally confronted him, his reaction was predictable. He laughed it off, calling it a joke, insisting that I was overreacting. But when I played the recording, his laughter faded, his face turning pale as he realized the gravity of the situation. You recorded us?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I met his gaze, feeling a strength I hadn't known before. "Yes, I did, and I've taken it to the authorities," I replied. The shock and fear in his eyes were almost satisfying, a small comfort after everything he'd put me through. He pleaded with me, trying to explain, but his words fell on deaf ears. I was done listening to his lies. Susan stood by me through the entire process, her support giving me the courage I needed to see it through. As I moved forward with the divorce, word spread through our circle of friends and neighbors. Thomas, Karen, and Lisa quickly became the talk of the town, their reputations in shambles. They turned on each other, each blaming the others for the failed scheme. The community's judgment was swift and unforgiving. I felt a sense of justice as I watched them struggle, finally facing the consequences of their actions. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding my life, finding comfort in the friends and family who had stood by me. Susan was my rock, helping me every step of the way. With her support, I found the strength to start anew, to let go of the hurt and betrayal that had once consumed me. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to face it head-on, determined to create a life free from deception and filled with genuine happiness. Reflecting on everything, I felt a strange mix of relief and closure. The ordeal had been painful, but it had shown me the importance of surrounding myself with people who truly cared. With the divorce finalized, I finally felt a sense of freedom, a weight lifted from my shoulders. I decided to sell some of the antiques in the warehouse, using the money to fund a long overdue vacation. My parents were thrilled when I invited them, and we planned our first overseas trip as a family. It was the perfect way to start fresh, a chance to leave the past behind and embrace the future with open arms. As we planned the details, I felt a spark of excitement that I hadn't felt in years. I looked forward to the journey ahead, grateful for the lessons learned and the people who had helped me along the way.